The Empty Child and The Doctor Dances were Steven Moffat's first episodes of the revived Doctor Who series. Widely regarded as a high point of the series by both viewers and those behind the show, including Christopher Eccleston himself, they were the episodes that introduced Captain Jack to the show and foregrounded sexuality in a way new for the show as well. Before these episodes, Moffat's career had mostly been in sitcoms, from the structurally playful relationship sitcoms Joking Apart and Coupling, to his sitcoms set in schools, Press Gang and Chalk. These Doctor Who episodes pushed both Moffat's career and the show itself forward in directions that would blossom out in the following years. The episodes are a collision of all sorts of interesting topics, sexual repression, and a leading woman character that stands out in the telos of Moffat's career, the progression of Moffat's structural and sexual sitcoms to the high-concept sci-fi of Doctor Who, the joint authorship of how the Captain Jack character came about, the progression of Moffat's technofarce style of writing technology, the patriotism and depiction of history in the World War II setting, the way the climax of the story works as a defining counterpoint to Eccleston's Doctor's characterization so far, and how the story in general feels like a summation and step forward for Moffat's career at this point in time. So we're going to discuss all of that and more as well. We being myself, Neo from Australia, along with Ingiga from England and Tomtit from Australia as well. Now, it's worth noting this conversation was recorded in November 2020. I often record stuff just when the moment strikes. I've always got stuff I can release on a rainy day, so to speak. So this was recorded between Doctor Who Series 12 and Revolution of the Daleks, still basically a year out from Flux, and therefore preceding the announcement of Russell T Davies returning to run the show once more, and also preceding the April 2021 reignition of controversy about conduct during the production of Russell T Davies' first era, such as in regards to John Barrowman. Now, at the end of this discussion, there'll be a new little 2022 extra conversation in the current present, just adding on a few more thoughts and reflecting on this earlier conversation. But for the most part, this is just a one-off discussion from 2020 about these two episodes. So let's open up that discussion by hearing what Ingiga thinks about how these episodes stand in terms of Moffat's career.
When you compare the story to Moffat's sex comedies and his sort of romantic farces, it strikes me that this is a story where it's kind of a rare glimpse of what those would be like if you took all the cynicism out, and instead of making them quite baleful and kind of critical, you turned it to a more empowering, a more liberatory purpose. You know, it feels like kind of a nice, wholesome version of the Moffat sex comedy, which isn't, in turn, of course, put to all these, like, Doctor Who-y possibilities to explore various other ideas. So it feels like maybe a bit of a watershed in his career, almost.
Yeah, it feels kind of trite to say, because, like, this is obviously the case, but the episode really does feel more like a successor of Joking Apart and Coupling, his previous sex comedies, rather than predecessor of some of his later Doctor Who work, at least stylistically, like you're talking about. Like the actual shape of the episode, the actual dialogue in the episode, I much more feel like it's kin to Coupling and stuff like that than to how he would end up writing in, the Matt Smith, maybe not, in the Peter Capaldi era anyway. And that's really interesting. I love that note of the cynicism kind of being drained out of it. Yeah, I can really see that.
Yeah, I agree that, like, the ending to The Doctor Dances kind of feels like the culmination of the entire first phase of Moffat's career. Like it's such a definitive statement of everything he was building towards with his previous shows. And yeah, I agree.
I agree with that. And then I listened to the commentary where Moff, like, growls, "You slut," at Nancy when she has the beautiful, acceptance thing with Jamie. And it's like the Joking Apart commentaries all over again.
And he's putting it all together in his big
she was a
Doctor Who brain.
She strayed.
He's thinking, "You slut, you little slapper,
you dirty little slapper."
I get that was big.
So you're busy later, dear. Yeah. So you're 21. Come into the TIMECODES.
But that's a meta author thing. In context of just the story, yeah, I agree. It feels like a lovely culmination of his career.
Yeah.
Can you speak any more to that? Because not everyone has watched Joking Apart and Coupling and can completely get what you're getting at there.
Before going too far into Joking Apart, I just want to say, on that note of Moffat being problematic in the commentary, like, as much as we can make this story out to be, about sexual liberation and empowerment and so on, it if you're a Moffat hater, you can still easily find the angles of attack. Like, it's still,
Of course.
Naturally, Moffat's still operating in his pigeonholes. His sexual liberation story has to take place through the prism of, motherhood, and Rose is like the prize that Jack and the Doctor are competing over. Rose doesn't have much of an arc in this story at all, really. So it's kind of, it's within Moffat's sort of narrow little box that he's working within. And yet, within that box, he does some things that are quite cool, but it's like, it's very much still Moffat, the problematic man, we all know.
Yes, very much so.
So on the joking apart front, I guess for people who haven't seen it, my experience personally, I've watched Joking Apart and I've seen bits of Coupling, but the sense of humour, and I think this leached into the Matt Smith era of Who a bit as well, is this sense of really gender essentialist, really kind of occasionally self-denigrating, often quite, denigrating the opposite sex, and just really quite negative view of male-female relationships and the contradictions involved and the way in which kind of the battle of the sexes kind of manifests in all these toxic ways. And, Moffat sort of indulged in that a lot. Joking Apart as a really kind of self-pitying look at his own divorce through a semi-autobiographical perspective. And, you can sort of look at that and think, well, this is really, it's a bit self-pitying, maybe it's a bit toxic almost, and it's not necessarily gesturing at a better society, it's just sort of wallowing in the, misery of the existing one. Whereas with Empty Child and The Doctor Dances, it's gesturing towards a more optimistic view of sex, if that makes any sense.
I would say for me that Coupling already did start to edge towards that more optimistic, I guess you'd call it sex positive sort of outlook on relationships. Like a lot of the stuff in Coupling is very sort of just celebratory of like the messiness of relationships, and it's very sort of just I think Moffat in that show has a lot of sympathy for all those characters, even if they make mistakes and so on. But I think that...
And Patrick made some pretty big ones.
Yeah. But I think that, like Empty Child is not a 180 from Coupling. It's more of like the next leap for Moffat, really, and just sort of drawing a line in the sand, to quote the excised line from the episode in terms of like, repression is the evil that will destroy the world, and sort of sexual openness and just understanding is the power of love, quite literally.
Something interesting with the repression angle with Nancy is that when I watch the episode now as an adult, the intuitive reading seems to me that she probably had consensual sex at 15 or 16, because so much of the themes of the story are around sexual repression and like admitting and opening up to your sexuality and that kind of thing. When I was much younger, I always assumed she was assaulted and like it was an unwanted pregnancy.
It's not something that I ever really got from the episode. I think that like the shame that she feels over the teenage pregnancy is sort of like that's sort of the limit of what a Doctor Who episode can take. Any further than that, and you're sort of like going beyond what the show can meaningfully address, beyond just like the barest hints. And like her sort of emotional turmoil is already, I think, difficult enough and like harrowing enough, especially in the script, like when she's hugging Jamie at the end and she's sort of like outpouring all of her sort of her difficult feelings on the subject. She talks about like God, and like she thought that like she had disappointed God, and basically that she's going to hell. And I imagine that was cut because like even that pushes it into too much sort of emotionally difficult territory.
It's interesting you raise that, because I think, and when we're talking about Moffat relationship with sex and relationships and gender over his career, I think that series 6 of Doctor Who, where Amy had that pregnancy and how that was all handled, I feel like that is when he did push up against the limits of what Doctor Who could do, and like things went awry because the limits he was exceeding what Doctor Who, at least in the way he was writing it, could achieve.
Yeah, you necessarily have to kind of shy away from it, or like just sort of ignore it, dash around it, be like, oh, we actually, raised our daughter as our best friend. It's fine.
Yeah.
And you think about it for more than 5 seconds, it's like, But yeah, that's much better handled in Empty Child, I think, those sorts of themes.
Yeah, I think if Empty Child had and even like small hints to support, your original reading, that Nancy might have been assaulted. I think its reputation over time might have been very different, because even something small like that is enough to kind of weight something quite a lot, and the conversations around it would be so different, I think. And the fact that it hasn't been that way and it's kind of more accepted as a quite wholesome sort of story, I think is indicative of just how people generally have taken it.
Even then, the fact that she has no boyfriend or whatever in the picture, like, it begs the question, is the man who she had sex with to have Jamie, is he dead? Like, was he bombed? I feel like any point where you start poking's the wrong, any point you start thinking through her predicament a little more, it's going to get darker just by necessity of it being a very humany womany realistic situation to end up in. But I guess that's the whole crux of the episode at the end, is that it was such a human situation.
Yeah, and I think it's just like the best way to do history in Doctor Who is like, you don't have to shy away from the fact that it was like a difficult place to be in. If you transgress these societal barriers, just like the gay man, who lives in the house that Nancy uses for the Marxism in action. It's a very interesting. Moff points this out on the commentary, that it's like a very much a deliberate parallel of like the repression, the repressive mechanisms that were present in the 40s.
Slightly controversial.
Yeah, slightly, yeah.
Really?
Yes.
Well, in that period, yeah.
But I thought it was quite a nice, just to get all writerly about it, it's quite a nice contrast, because you've got Captain Jack, who simply doesn't understand the concept of straight or gay or bi or anything. He just, if a Dalek has a short enough skirt, she's in.
Or never mind, you can't say those kind of things about a big enough plunger. But
is to contrast that incredibly sort of relaxed, civilized attitude with this, and I said, in a sense, the whole story is about sexual repression, because Nancy hasn't admitted the child is hers and all that, so I thought that was relevant. Also, it was quite funny. That was quite. So how do you, Mr. Haverstock?
It's all about sex, isn't it?
It really is an extraordinary degree about sex, or as I like to say, dancing.
I think on that note, something that kind of struck me is that the different kinds of sexual repression that we see, and the way that sort of sex is represented it's the patriarchal structure of it is what comes through. So, like, not just the fact that, Nancy is kind of, part of Nancy's shame is being single, she's not married to this guy who she had this child with or whatever. And the fact that, she's shamed for, breaking some morality taboo from not being pure. And, the idea of women being pure is this whole thing that's used to control women, of course. And then, of course, you have the fact that, the evacuee children, they've been abused by men. That's alluded to. There was a man there at the farm. And then even, the guy who's kind of hiding his dalliances with the butler, like, that's something, that's also kind of a sort of a patriarchal thing. But, like, he, in the sense, I wouldn't say he's getting away with it per se, but I think the fact that he's a man kind of deflects some suspicions, doesn't it? Because, like, it deflects, people are suspecting that it might be his wife who's fooling around with the butler, but of course it's him. So it's always kind of men who have more of the power in the situation, whereas, again, kind of the women and the children and such who are kind of more the victims of it.
On this topic, what do you think of the scene where the Doctor kind of reveals to Rose, in the 51st century, pansexuality is the norm, when she's surprised at Jack, having a thing with that other military man? What do you think of Rose's reaction, both the dialogue and her facial expressions in that scene? And also, remember that scene in Aliens of London on the rooftop? Maybe that's relevant.
Yeah, I feel like it's maybe in character for Rose to react like that, given that she called the Doctor, "Oh, you're so gay" earlier. Like, Rose's particular prejudices and beliefs notwithstanding, like it might be that. And maybe it's a 2005 thing, but certainly looking at it now, to finding out that Jax, swings both ways, it doesn't feel like it's some shocking alien development that could only happen in the 51st century, but perhaps it was different at the time. I don't know.
I think what's interesting there too is like that "you're so gay" line was, of course, in a Russell T Davies episode, and he said something about how it was like a realistic depiction of how people actually talk. Real people talk like this, if you will. I feel like it's at this point in series 1 where we start getting gay characters a lot more to the fore, and it's just interesting that this is coming from, gender essentialist, very heterosexual Moffat, who introduces Captain Jack, who has these other gay characters in the episode we've talked about. And then since Jack joins the TARDIS team, Boomtown and the finale are more of an aspect of that. But I think it's interesting that for all the reputation, and Russell T Davies really did garner that in the later series of Doctor Who, I don't feel like series 1 before this point was as RTD-ish as what Moffat made it here. Does that make any sense, what I'm throwing around here?
Kind of. I think the reason I think Moffat is able to play with this so well, despite him nominally being the super het writer, is that I think Jack's queerness kind of forms an element of Jack's take on masculinity, and Moffat might be whatever writing about LGBTQ characters, but like when it comes to masculinity, it's one of Moffat's recurring obsessions, and the whole story forms this sort of competition a bit between the Doctor's type of masculinity and Jack's kind of omnisexual, kind of super easygoing, laid back nature, and his flexibility, his chameleonicness. That's a part of him. That's part of his style, and kind of what makes him so kind of alluring in some ways. And that's something that Moffat can sort of play with, that sort of with these kind of competing levels of different things.
It's like he has this supreme confidence because he's totally unrestrained from, all these neuroses Moffat characters, especially in his sex comedies, will have of like, oh, I'm not gay. Like when it's Jeff and Patrick in coupling at the sex shop when they're looking for Patrick's dildo, and they're having to, insist to the clerk that we're not gay, we're not buying it to use together. Like, so many of his characters are afflicted by this fear of being identified as gay, and that in turn is, like, not a confident thing, and so therefore it's not a masculine thing in Moffat's conception of, his gender essentialist way of viewing masculinity. So it's interesting that Jack, in being, like, pansexual, is so much more masculinized than the heterosexual characters. Is that making sense?
I would have to butt in with an actually here. Coupling. There is also like scenes where actually no, I think I just realized that what I'm about to say is a bad point. So I'm not going to say it. But like there is a scene where Jeff deliberately portrays himself as Patrick's boyfriend.
Oh yes, to the old woman.
But that's also like that's as a prank on him. But
yeah, true.
Yeah. I don't know. You can cut that.
With that whole Rose, you're so gay thing, and also what happens later with, Jack snogging the Doctor and stuff, I think, and in this particular story, the way in which the Doctor is almost, the whole thing of, like, being maybe being a bit emasculated compared to Jack, I think there's a great degree of, like, the way in which Eccleston's Doctor, despite, looking like this hard man, is kind of, he has this feminine side to him, and I think ultimately by the end of the story, he is able to, he comes to terms with that, and that's part of what puts him ahead in the end. I think ultimately with this whole sort of discussion over masculinity that happens in the story, what we end up with is that the idea that the Doctor's sensitivity, his compassion, the fact that, he doesn't wave the biggest kind of phallic sonic device, or he doesn't have like the kind of dashing Star Trek, tech or whatever. He can be a bit plain, he can be a bit awkward. But it's the fact, it's those aspects of him which he is not stereotypically masculine that make him perhaps, the more confident, the more powerful figure by the end of the story. I mean, the final scene of this story is just like the ritual humiliation of Jack, while he just stands there playing the third wheel while the Doctor, lives it up, swinging Rose all over the TARDIS. And it's like some kind of weird psychosexual thing going on there.
And it's very much like a celebration of just sort of the rubbishness of Doctor Who. Like from the very beginning of the episode, you have Moffat undercutting like the fact that they always end up on Earth, and the very first scene with the Doctor in the jazz club is him just making a complete arse of himself. But yeah, like you said, of course, in the end, that's what sort of makes the Doctor win in the end, is his own sort of like modesty, I suppose, or yeah, just like his lack of needing to be the best, I suppose, is yeah, his own virtue.
And I think what's nice is that both the Doctor and Jack kind of have journeys to go on in that sense. Obviously, by the end of the story, the Doctor remembers that he too can dance. But meanwhile, Jack, who, when we first meet Jack, he's presented as almost like a copy of the Doctor, but with dating and dancing, as Rose says. But as we see, even though Jack is this incredibly liberated figure, incredibly confident, really sexually open, really easygoing, hedonistic, we also see how he's kind of a coward. He kind of doesn't have that commitment or investment in, humanity or compassion and such. He's a con man. He's doing stuff that's endangered everyone. And by the end of the story, he sort of, he stops passing the buck. He makes a decision to sacrifice himself to stop this bomb, destroying humanity or whatever. And, that's kind of his heroic transformation as well. And of course he doesn't die in the end because he gets rescued and it's all well and good. But what's really nice is that we just see the two characters going on almost opposite journeys. The Doctor becomes more self-interested in a sense, being more willing to dance and kind of get frisky with Rose. Whereas Jack becomes more of a more heroic, more compassionate, more of more self-sacrificing and stuff.
And we come to find out that Jack has a stolen spaceship, much like the Doctor.
Yeah, of course.
And he has a mysterious blank past with the missing years, which is very similar to the Time War backstory. So yeah, it is very much a leveling of the playing field between Jack and the Doctor. And I even love the way that in the Doctor Dances, where they're all trapped in that room and Jack disappears, and then Rose and the Doctor are dancing and they don't realize that they're on Jack's ship. And that sort of visual trick of not realizing where you are is sort of reversed on Jack at the very end, where he doesn't realize that the TARDIS is now connected to his ship. It's really good, really great connection between visuals and story. Fantastic.
Yeah, the mirroring of those two scenes is fantastic. Jack even uses the psychic paper on Rose earlier. All of the parallels between him and the Doctor are set up manifold and over and over and over again. Really rams it home. And I think also Rose keeps bringing up Spock, doesn't she? Because she has, it starts interrogating these expectations of the sci-fi genre and the idea of sci-fi adventurers, with Jack being perhaps the more conventional one. And then on the other hand, the Doctor is kind of lauding the rubbishness of Doctor Who, as you put it, compared to these more dashing IPs.
I see it as Moffat. He's basically extending an olive branch to these more socially and culturally acceptable forms of sci-fi, which are your Star Warses and to a lesser extent Star Trek, and saying that basically these two things aren't as different as they first appear. Doctor Who can dance and Star Wars is also a little bit rubbish, because Captain Jack is so Han Solo. I mean, he even has the beat at the end where you think he's left the heroes for dead, and then he swoops in on the bomb, and it's very much the Star Wars coming in and literally infesting Doctor Who with the nanogenes, and it's a different logic of science fiction invading the narrative and causing havoc. Very, very meta.
On the point of romances and stuff and kind of dashingness and things like that, it strikes me that one story that it's really easy to link this one to is Curse of Fenric, because obviously that's the other iconic Who story about sex and war. And I think with this story, the way in which Moffat weaves the sex comedy, the kind of rom-com element, the romance, dancing by Big Ben, into all these other ideas is kind of perhaps the first big instance in New Who of the show really going for that kind of Fenric style matrix of ideas and kind of really ambitious storytelling that all ultimately comes down to something small and human. So where, Fenric has the Doctor verbally obliterating Ace at the climax, this has the Doctor kind of encouraging Nancy to embrace, her child and stuff. And it's, and I feel like the thing that, New Who kind of proves at this point that it has above classic Who as an advantage is the fact it can actually do sex and romance. The fact it can actually make the story into a romance just, gives it so much more power in terms of doing a story about sex compared to something like Fenric, where you kind of get that really uncomfortable scene where Ace has to try and chat up the guard. Whereas, in this story, Jack can just, go and chat up the guard in 2 seconds because he's completely sexually free, It's a wonderful kind of parallel, and it's really interesting mark of the show's evolution.
You know what, though? It's really weird. In my notes, I sort of had that, I really liked the way this story made the past feel like a dangerous place, and it reminded me a lot of sort of some of the Hartnell historicals. And then, I thought that it's also very Curse of Fenric. It's sort of picking up where Curse of Fenric left off. But then I kind of thought, the Doctor and Jack in this story remind me in a weird way of the Doctor and Ian in like the very first classic stories, because I've just been reading the Doctor Who and the Daleks novel, and like this sort of the battle of machismo between the Doctor and Ian is so pronounced in that story. Like the Doctor has this whole motif of like there's only one captain of the ship, and like he's just constantly competing and undermining Ian. And so like I think the Doctor and Jack rivalry, while it is expressed in entirely like modern and sophisticated terms, it does also hark back to like something that was present a little bit in Doctor Who's roots, which I loved.
If we're talking representations of history, I may stand on a 60-second soapbox for a while, because I have some issues with the big speech about, you know, right now the German war machine is rolling across Europe, countries falling like dominoes. A little tiny damp island. One tiny damp little island says no. A mouse in front of a lion. And then the Doctor just congratulates Britain over and over again. I've never liked this. When I was 11, it just kind of pulled me out of the story because it felt so... I couldn't identify what was going on back then, but something about it felt off to me. Something about it felt not of a piece. Although I think... Okay, I'll get into that later. But I think... It's not just that it's Doctor Who offering up it's articulating a very ideological view of history, rather than just presenting history as, you know, whatever fictional form it's going to shape it into. But I dislike this idea of the show so much buying into, you know, a falsehood. Like the whole idea of Britain being completely alone and helpless, that's a founding myth that started cohering in the 1960s to justify the post-colonial welfare state. They needed to justify the loss of empire by exaggerating loneliness that didn't really exist. Britain still had all the reserves and the industry of Australia, Canada, India, had the plundered wealth of the states that it had colonized. The issue was, it was so large, the empire was so large, that it had the classic double-edged sword of empire, that it had the ability to call upon these reserves, but it had the defense obligations that it had to defend them. Like the image of a mouse to me isn't a country that has a navy that is stretched so thin over all these territories over the entire planet that it's subjugated. And then the episode only speaks in terms of Germany. Like it's not talking about Japan at all, where Japan starting to attack Australia, of course, contextualizes some of those fears better. But it frustrated me as a child because something about it felt jarring, and it frustrates me as an adult because I don't like Doctor Who selling super ideological versions of history to children like myself at the time I watched it. Do you think that's just an unavoidable part of Doctor Who being written by British writers who think of history Britishly? Or what do you think?
I think it's weird that we hear that speech in the mouth of the Doctor, isn't it? Because we trust the Doctor. The Doctor's the one who exists outside of time and doesn't share our petty biases. So anything you put in his mouth, it's going to be given this air of legitimacy, isn't it? So when he starts spouting propaganda, basically, for this, you know, blisteringly inaccurate and kind of sort of apologetic and ridiculous kind of vision of Britain and the war, it's like, it's really, I think it's fundamentally like weird. Like at the end of the day, like an alien from beyond space and time, there's no real reason for him to give a shit about Britain specifically. Like it's one thing for him to love humans or Earth, but like, you know, it's just, it's almost fourth wall breaking when he suddenly starts, you know, fetishizing Britain specifically, especially if you happen to know more than, you know, what you were told in school as a British child about Britain. So yeah, it's dodgy in the extreme.
It's also a little bit strange coming off of like Nancy pouring her heart out about her own situation. Like I struggle to think that it would be that much of a comfort to her, like all this rhetoric, this sort of wishy-washy narrative. And the other weird thing about that scene is that it happens again in The Doctor Dances. One of the structurally weird things about this two-parter is that lots of scenes happen twice. You have Jack explaining the con twice at the end of Empty and at the start of Dances. And you have kind of Rose doing a revised version of the war encouragement scene with Nancy, except the second time Rose just straight up tells her that they win. And I kind of think that's a better version of the scene, because like that's kind of her telling Nancy that like she has a future, you know, like... Yeah,
works better for me because I think it plays into the themes of the stories more, that Nancy can't conceive of a future, and Rose, you know, she's doing it through the version of, you know, England rah rah, but it's something that actually applies to Nancy, whereas the Doctor
Yeah.
just spouting inaccurate propaganda. That's probably why I was jarred out of it as a child, because it doesn't feel like it's connecting to the story. It just feels like it's soapboxing about the setting.
Yeah, and it juts out because I think one of the strengths of this story is that everything works independently, and it also works to sort of bolster the overarching themes. But that is the outlier, where it seems sort of shoved in there.
Yeah, with that first scene, I think on my rewatch, it occurred to me that I think what Moffat's trying to do is that because Nancy is about to go off and, you know, go back to the house or whatever, do whatever it is she's going to do, and she's got to be brave and stuff. I think the Doctor is trying to link Nancy's bravery to this imaginary idea of, like, you know, the sort of British bulldog, like the British bravery, hence bringing up, like, oh, with a mouse in front of the lion. Oh, I don't know what you did to Hitler, but you frightened the hell out of me. And this, like, imaginary concept of Britishness as some, you know, brave force, some really like powerful characteristic that kind of makes people so brave. And it's all, you know, it's all complete made up kind of piffle, of course, but like this idea of imaginary Britishness is kind of floating around a lot. And yeah, and it's kind of, even in other ways, you can kind of see it popping out. Like the hospital is called Albion Hospital, and that's gesturing at this idea of an imaginary, fictitious, kind of idealized version of Britain, perhaps. And it's a bit odd because, like you say, Tit, like it doesn't intuitively map necessarily onto the matrix of ideas that the rest of the story is exploring. Like the link to maybe like sex is not so obvious, you know, and the fact that the story is so, I think, while it doesn't explicitly condemn stuff like, you know, imperialism or the war machine, whatever, like its sense of the moral horror of war is reflected all over the story. Like the central threat of it is these gas masked people, right? Like war and, you know, the forces that cause it are kind of viewed with sort of horror and suspicion and sadness and stuff. So it's really weird and contradictory to be just uncritically praising all these, like, kind of the sort of stuff that, like, the government would tell you. Like, oh, you're British, yes, keep calm and carry on. You know, it's like, it's going in the wrong direction compared to the rest of the story.
I'm sure it's also very influenced by, like, the World War II movies that I'm sure were, like, saturated in Britain during the time Moffat was a kid, which I have seen none of those sorts of movies, frankly. So I don't really know anything about them. It's
a 1916 onwards perception of Britain that it's based on, much more than the 1940s reality. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. There's another interesting cut line to do with this. It's during the scene where Rose tells Nancy that they win the war, and it's a joke that they cut where Nancy is like shocked. She says, "Oh my god, do we really win?" And then Rose finishes the scene off by saying, "Only downside, all the movies," which is kind of funny and ironic considering, you know, what Moffat did in that earlier scene is not particularly sophisticated compared to how those movies would have played out.
Yeah. I think the other missing piece of the whole historical aspect of the story is the references to the welfare state. And they even joke on the DVD that the actor for the old Doctor, who, you know, counsels the old lady by getting a leg back at the end, that he wears a look of pride on his face when the Doctor calls out about the welfare state that could suggest him being involved in how the NHS came about or whatever. I feel like that stuff plays a little more coherently into the themes around sexuality and whatnot. Because I'm not schooled on what the welfare state at the time connected to, or what the NHS does, or at least it did when it was first formed. But I feel like welfare connects more to themes of sexuality or young mothers having children than just rah-rahing about little lonely Britain defeating Hitler does. Do you know what I mean?
I think the key is really the idea of healing. Because, you know, obviously that links into the nanogenes, that they have ambulances in wars, you know, this is what it means to be a doctor of war, you know, not to jump ahead 12 years, but like the idea of, even in the depths of kind of a brutal war, like, you know, the concept of healing and people kind of helping each other and kind of healing from trauma and stuff and healing each other. And the idea of helping each other is endemic, and it will always kind of break through. And that idea kind of rings through all of Moffat Who, of course. And obviously, you know, it's about the Doctor, who is himself a healer, who is often involved in wars and conflicts and stuff. And it's like, when it comes to the NHS and stuff, I do think that, the story being like a rah, 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 oh yes, you know, we made the NHS, we're so great, you know, I think that view of things kind of, maybe smooths over stuff. Like, all over this story, you can see things like, I mean, well, part of the story revolves around these children who don't have anything to eat. They have to sneak into other people's houses and like to find food, which is also being got on the black market because, food is being rationed. People don't have stuff to eat. Like the public is being squeezed to pay for this whole war economy. And meanwhile, the black market, people extracting profit from it. Like it's a completely corrupt society, right? But this kind of false idea that, it had to be that way. But then, we made the NHS, so it's all good and stuff. I think it's easy to use things that are good in service of kind of making excuses for stuff that was bad, or kind of just smoothing over like any sort of societal critique, which I think the story maybe slightly runs the risk of doing at times.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I'd be remiss if I didn't point out the visual parallel between Mark from Joking Apart at the microphone and the Doctor doing his unintentional stand-up at the jazz club. Like, my species left me, or my planet left me.
Just one more thing on the sex front is that I feel like even if not everything is necessarily feeding towards some overarching statement or message or reading or whatever, there's imagery kind of all over the story that kind of reinforces the sex thing. I mean, like Jack riding in on the bomb at the end, like straddling it in that incredibly sort of kind of phallic manner. Like, it's almost like war could be seen as quite a rich setting for a story about sex, because there's so much imagery already out there. Like, straddling the bomb, like that's borrowed. All these ideas are kind of borrowed and kind of smashed together. And then you have like the idea of bombs and the way that, like, at one point during Rose and Jack's kind of rooftop flirtation, like, I think Jack's talking about the bomb that's going to blow up the Chula warship, and Rose is like, promises. Like, everything can be a sexual innuendo. The idea of an explosion, and the idea of kind of sex being something that we do when we're under the threat of being blown to pieces. I mean, that's an idea straight from Watchmen, isn't it? Sex and the bomb have always had this weird relationship. So it's such a big storm of ideas, images that are all over the place, and they bounce off each other in a really satisfying way that just makes the story really, really exciting and fun to watch, even all these years later.
I think the script in general, it's just, Moffat says on the commentary that he basically had 4 proper drafts, like 4 full drafts, but 16 or 17 drafts as you go and you're changing things. And just like any script that's been through that many iterations, I feel like more and more parallels and connections must have kept exploding as he kept writing more, having to rewrite things or change things. The story just all links together in such a lovely, lovely way. It's very enjoyable. Because
I guess you got to remember, like, this could have very well been the last Doctor Who that he ever got to write for TV, so it's like, it's all in there, like he thought this could have been his only shot. Thankfully it wasn't, but yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit like the first episode of Joking Apart. Like, he could have stopped at this point, but his whole era is already encapsulated in that story. I mean, even, it struck me on the note of, like, sex parallels and stuff, like, there's that whole exchange where the Doctor talks about how he destroyed the weapons factory in Villigard and replaced it with a banana grove, and, he swaps Jack's gun out for a banana, and it's like this, like, battle of the phallus kind of thing, like, and, they're competing over, like, the sonic devices and stuff, and with the whole banana thing, the Doctor seems to be in the lead, but of course then he whips out his sonic, which is this piddly little thing. And the sonic kind of the sonic thing is kind of what makes that trying to resonate concrete scene so funny, because he's pointing this little device, and it's like, it just sort of in that one image, and his like completely sort of shy response to Rose's invitation, it's like, I think the fact that he's just all the sort of phallic imagery, it just kind of comes together in that image, and he just, it just encapsulates how emasculated he risks being sort of this guy who doesn't have, like, who isn't swinging the big weapon around. But, it's just very funny. I think there's just levels of comedy happening just all over the place.
Yeah, even there's a cut that I love between Rose saying, finally a professional, in regards to Jack, and then we see the Doctor in these ridiculous little binoculars. I don't know if they're supposed to look silly, maybe it's just me, but like, just on Eccleston's head he looks like an owl or something, or like I don't know, but just like his quaintness, the quaintness of the Doctor is so highlighted.
With Jack, this is a huge, particularly we're recording this in 2020, so Captain Jack looms very large right now, since he's returning in the festive special Revolution of the Daleks with Jodie Whittaker, Chris Chibnall's version of Doctor Who. So this is 15 years after he originated in The Empty Child. This is a big, big, big character. He led a 4-series spin-off, Torchwood. He appeared on Russell T Davies' Doctor Who quite a few times, quite a lot of episodes. He's very, very popular. Who made him is an interesting question, and I think it speaks to how fans understand how characters come about in interesting ways. On one level, John Barrowman is pretty responsible for this character because he's a huge proponent of the show. He's a constant presence at cons. He's always at cons. People love him at cons. He's a huge personality at cons. He is a huge personality, and that personality, I think you guys would agree, is pretty in sync with Captain Jack a lot of the time.
Yeah, to a certain extent, he's playing this sort of exaggerated version of himself, and he's sort of playing maybe his ideal sort of self. I don't know.
Yeah. So you can't divorce, like when you read a Torchwood book, and I have many times, Captain Jack, is one of those characters that I think you need to hear perform because Barrowman is such a huge part of him. So Barrowman's obviously a huge part of this character. Russell T Davies, I mean, he told Moffat to write this character, and Moffat wrote this character. And I often see people get confused or debate this kind of point of what the genesis of the character was. So I'm going to read out a quote from Steven Moffat here, which was, "I was given 400 provisos, laughs Stephen. Jack, or Jax, Jax, as he was then, had to be a military man, heroic and dashing, good with guns. And although it wasn't a big part of the brief, he was pansexual." So the brief, of course, was from Russell T Davies. This isn't stuff that Moffat originated yet. Back to the quote. "I also knew that he was on board specifically because there was going to be a grand battle in the last episode, and they needed to have a soldier around to do the soldiery bits." Side note, that kind of links back to what you were saying, Tom, about the Ian and Doctor stuff, because that's, of course, a huge part of the male companions in the 60s era, was often that they got to do the action hero-y bits that, perhaps William Hartnell wasn't sprightly enough for. The quote goes on, "The idea of him being this kind of intergalactic con man pretending to be a time agent was mine, Moffat's. My story really needed him to be a human, not an alien. We already have the Doctor, who is embarrassingly human for an alien, so I made Jack a human from the future. As I knew he was staying on, it made better story sense." And then this isn't a part of the quote, this is from the commentary, but the 2 missing years of Jack when he was a time agent, that 2 years were just wiped from his memory and he didn't know what happened in them or what they were about, that was, of course, from Moffat. And Moffat is amused that Russell T Davies said he would do some story thing with that eventually, and then he completely forgot to, so the TV show never got to do anything with it. But what do we think about the mixture of Russell T Davies and Steven Moffat stuff in the conception of Jack, or Jax? So a lot of the character is from the brief of Russell T Davies, but a huge amount of it is from the fact that Moffat, in his very sex comedy machismo style, wrote this character in the first place and originated a lot of the famous Captain Jack concepts. What do you think of this interplay between Russell T Davies, Steven Moffat, and John Barrowman in creating the character?
I think it turned out really well, didn't it? Like, I think even that little detail in Russell's brief that he's pansexual, Moffat's able to spin that to something that made a huge impact, and ultimately kind of the queerness of Captain Jack ended up becoming quite a big part of the character going on into Torchwood and stuff. Like, it's one of those things that people remember about him the most. Chibnall reintroduces him in Fugitive of the Jadoon by having him kiss Graham. So it's like that whole thing. He's like that destabilizing element, and it's kind of, it makes sense, and seeing how this character's kind of had a different sort of afterlife and how he's been written differently after kind of leaving Moffat's pen, but still has that Moffat DNA in him. It sort of, I guess it's what you'd expect to happen if Moffat came up with a character and then they were sort of given over to RTD to sort of like shepherd and kind of like steward or whatever. And because we see, like, the arc that he perhaps goes on is like a very RTD-ish sort of growth, but from that initial seed that is quite Moffat-esque. Because, like, he's not quite the same in this story as he is in his subsequent ones. Like, he's got more of that Moff flair to him in this story because it's, it's a Moff script. And I think I think it's only natural. Like, I think the Jack that we know today isn't all there in that first story. Like, it's just, he's maybe a bit more straightforward, a bit simpler. But I think it's quite heartening. Like, I'm quite happy to learn that Moff was responsible for some of those iconic bits, because it feels like, maybe like I still don't want to go as far as calling Jack like a Moffat character, because it's kind of like he's just changed so much over time, but it feels like Moffat was kind of like maybe a co-parent or something. Like he was a sperm donor.
Well, I'm not like a massive fan of Captain Jack. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm by no means an anti. Like, I think it's cool that New Who has a recurring element. You know, he's sort of the only original like creation to be sort of passed between the three showrunners so far, I think. Could very easily be wrong on that. But yeah, I guess for me, like the iteration of Jack in this two-parter, I tend to enjoy more than the more fully formed. And like, I do have to admit, he is more fully formed later on. But what I really like about him in this is that he's just so on the back foot for the whole thing. Like, he's kind of a boob. Like, just the way you sort of strip away the outer veneer of like professionalism, and you find out that he's sort of, you know, fake, and his ship's kind of shitty, and yeah, just that sort of underdogness. Whereas later on in like Torchwood and stuff, he's more of the classic mysterious like cult action hero, and I think that totally works as well. But yeah, it's definitely an evolution, you know. Like I also wouldn't say that like, oh, Moffat invented Jack Harkness, certainly not. Yeah,
I think he's kind of a microcosm of how TV writing tends to work in general. It's not so simple as to split Russell T Davies created this character. Well, yes, but Steven Moffat created this character. Kind of. I think it's a good kind of learning lesson in how a lot of TV writing actually tends to work. It's not so simple as we can boil it down to one creative voice a lot of the time.
You know, Tit, that thing you said about liking Jack more in this story compared to his later appearances, like, that's not the first time I've heard that opinion. Like, I might even agree with it, I'm not sure. But, like, I think it's because, you know, Moffat, in that way that he does, he writes Jack in this story as sort of a clean expression of an idea that he wants to explore. Like this idea of, you know, a fallible, dashing captain whose sort of, whose confidence is kind of a mask and stuff. And, you know, he writes that in a way that's really, it's kind of, I'm not sure how to say this, but like, because obviously we see later in Moffat's run, he writes characters who are kind of like fairy tales, who have kind of those archetypal roles to them, rather than all those details about, you know, what's Clara's grand's name and stuff. They don't necessarily have all that muddiness and little details to them, but they're expressions of ideas. And Jack is very much that in this first story. Whereas, you know, as he goes on and gets all these other things added to him, you know, he becomes more muddied and more kind of ambiguous. So, in this first story, he really is just this like dashing, like he has a level of purity to him in the kind of the simplicity of the idea behind him, I think.
Or to put it another way, like if you take Torchwood aside, this is the only time Jack's been on Doctor Who in a story that feels like it was actually written for him, you know? Because in all his other appearances, like, he's just one of the gang. He becomes a short-term companion series 1, and in the other, like, finales and stuff, he's really sort of intruding from Torchwood into Doctor Who, which isn't to say he doesn't have interesting things to do in those stories, but, like, they're not crafted around him the way this two-parter is. Or, like, the nanogenes coming for me is not, like, part of the themes of Fugitive. It's very much like, here's your intro to Jack, and the story is sort of about Jack-related stuff. And yeah, that's very attractive storytelling-wise.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Like, this really is like the only story where we're introducing Jack kind of makes it also about Jack, and Jack is actually woven into the themes of this story as a part of it. Like, this story is in Jack's DNA as a character. Like, it is the basis of him, and I think anything that has such a good source material to work from as this two-parter is probably going to have a really solid longevity and like a long afterlife in the minds of viewers and fans and stuff. Because, you know, it's just this story is such an inherently rich set of ideas that anything that is drawn from it and kind of, you know, chosen to continue on in the show is just going to be inherently interesting, but not necessarily as interesting as it was in this first story, which is just, you know, so good. You know, I hate to gush, but you know, there it is.
This isn't connected to Jack. If there's any other thoughts on Jack, this is probably the time to say him. But I want to talk about technology next.
I'm ready for technology.
Yeah, same.
Okay, so I don't have a huge thesis here or anything, but technology is very present in this episode, even though it's set in 1941. We have the tape recorder that shouldn't be in England at this time, because it was invented in Germany, but England didn't have tape recorders like that yet. We have the typewriters, we have the phones, we have the speakers, and of course the scares of the story come through Jamie's voice coming through these devices in ways they shouldn't. We get the thing of the Doctor being called on the TARDIS phone, which is such a jarring image. That's not something that's meant to happen, and that's what starts the story. We get the creepy scene with the writing on the typewriter, kind of the Shining style. How does this play into the wider course of Moffat writing about technology? Does it play at all? Is there any connection to how he wrote technology on his sitcoms, or is this entirely just a function of this is a story set in 1941 and the villain makes a scary sentence that comes through things?
Well, to add to your list of examples, in the script, one of the directions is describing the cliffhanger to the empty child, and it says, the empty child can cut round all the viewpoints like a vision mixer. And a vision mixer being the thing like in TV production which switches between shots, basically. I don't have like a professional level knowledge of this, but it's very illustrative of the way that like Moffat's horror of the empty child is in the way that the empty child can control like the logic of the story and the way it's actually presented to you, and it can how do you put this? Like make the viewer feel dumb, you know, for like all those moments where you know, you don't realize that the tape recorder is still going, or you don't realize that the boy isn't at the typewriter anymore, you know? It's like just completely alienating the viewer. And it's also super tied into like this sort of motif of technology basically exacerbating the worst sort of impulses of people. And Moffat didn't invent this idea, but I think like his technofarces are really great articulations of it. Like the basically like in his sitcoms, like answering phones are there how you sow the seeds of your own destruction, and like phone calls are how you get caught up in, you know, false identities and how you end up in multiple places at once, and yeah, blah 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 blah. And in this story you have like the idea of the nanogenes misinterpreting something, not maliciously, but it's just a pure misinterpretation. And for me, like, you have all these evil, malevolent AIs in science fiction, and somehow, like, the idea of an AI that's just inept is even scarier. And I can't explain why, but it's just like the complete...
It's like a child. It's like a child. It's
like a child, yeah. Like, it doesn't... Its vocabulary is not ours. It's just like, you know, like, of course it thinks that Jamie is how people are supposed to be. And that also plays into the idea of normalization. Like, you know, because the nanogenes think that this horror is normal. And so, like, the threat of the story is, like, that literally becoming normal. And, you know, you counteract that by normalizing, you know, Nancy's sort of openness and accepting, you know, what's going on. It's so rich, like, the weaving of horror and themes. Yeah.
I feel like there's a kind of horror of hopelessness with children or inept technology like that, because there's no capacity in which it can be reasoned with. Like Dave in 2001, you can have a conversation with him. He might not agree with you, but he's intelligent enough to entertain a conversation about, oh, should I shoot you out the airlock or whatever. When someone's an adult or when someone's an intelligent AI, there's the capacity that at least maybe you can get through to them. But when it's just a dumb bunch of nanogenes, I think it's so much scarier, because what are you going to do? It's like a primal thing.
Yeah. And you know what? I really hate when people say that like writers of sci-fi are like Charlie Brooker is a Nostradamus, or, you know, RTD is a Nostradamus or something like that. But I think that like the vision of the nanogenes in this story, it really reminds me of like what AI turned out to actually be, which is that companies release these AIs sort of just as a toy, basically. Like, I don't know, Cleverbot, I'm pretty sure Microsoft had one. And what happens is just like Nazis immediately pile onto it, and then that's how it learns how to behave. And so it's just completely corrupted. It's so much like that. And that's just such an intuitive, like, you know, watching this in 2020, it feels like the vision of technology is still real. And like, even when Moff gets criticized relentlessly for like his sort of boomery ways and lines about selfies and whatever, but when the Doctor says software patch, I'm emailing the upgrade, and that's sort of the triumphant hero line, it should be embarrassing, but it's somehow, it just like, it makes perfect sense. Like, it feels like second nature. Like, yeah, of course that's what he's doing. Like, that's how technology works. you correct the fault, so to speak.
Moffat's fixation with the benevolent AI, I think, like you say, it's scarier because it's real. Like, it is inherently more likely and more realistic that an AI designed to be benevolent would have an error in it or just be, incompetent, than it is that an AI would turn evil and decide, I'm going to destroy humanity. It just hooks into something that's just simple and real, and it is scarier in that way. I think with the, what strikes me about the technology in this story is that the empty child and the empty people, and the way in which it can communicate through all technology, it kind of renders it like as kind of a disembodied ghost almost, because we're often hearing from the child through the phone lines or on the typewriter more than we actually see the child almost. And it's like that disembodying element is kind of suggesting that almost in becoming empty, this empty child is like this soulless ghost that's like being reproduced through the industrialization of society. Like, it's being reproduced indefinitely. So that is quite interesting.
Yeah, and it's like the anonymizing effect of war as well, and you catch glimpses of like the gas mask when the light catches it, and you can see through the back of it, and it's so creepy.
Yeah, I think at the climax of the cliffhanger of the first episode, there's a shot where you can see right into Jamie's like eye lenses or whatever, and it looks like there's no face behind them. Like, I couldn't tell if it was a special effect or not. It looks almost like it could be one. There's a shot where like it just really seems like a black void in there. It's dead creepy.
That is in the script, so they did pay deliberate attention to that. But yeah, it's like you don't see the child and you just see the Doctor Who monster, which is like sort of, you can also do like a meta reading of it. Like, it's the nanogenes are sort of imposing an aesthetic onto the story, like Doctor Who monsters are good, love is bad. And it's sort of about erasing that.
We remember that, like, the gas mask design that is so creepy, I mean, it's just a normal gas mask. Like, the scary element from here is drawn from reality. And the fact that humans are kind of monsterized when they have to take these precautions to defend themselves from chemical warfare. And that's what I meant earlier when I said, like, the story shows that horror at the idea of war kind of subtextually through elements of the story, even if it doesn't, like, go on a soapbox about it.
Yeah. Moffat, in writing the story, he said, and of course, gas masks look creepy. I saw a little picture of a boy in a gas mask that looked so scary because there is nothing more symptomatic of a world gone wrong than a child in a gas mask. So I think you're on the money there.
Also, just one more thing. Like, I think we basically already said this, but I think I really love that image of the fact that the nanogenes find, the dead body of the child and kind of sort of reproduce that, because it's this idea that a society is only as progressed or as fortunate as its least fortunate person. So this idea that the threat in the story, the risk is that, even if just, one child has just been abandoned and to be a victim of this war, like, if we were all judged by that metric, then we would all be made like him. And that kind of gives a moral angle to kind of the threat of the story. Like, it's almost like a condemning of, what society has become, through the means of this, Chula warship, this sex bomb, so to speak, landing on London.
And like, that's part of why it's scary, I think, as well, is that it's that element of sort of shame. Like, you don't like looking at it because it's, he's calling for his mother, and it's sort of that element of like, people are telling you that you have to stay away from him, but you want to help him. It's like that mixture of sympathy and fear, which makes it like so unique. Yeah. I also love the touch of the fact that okay, so we got to talk about the Chula warship. I love the fact that the Chula warship has like a name, because I think in the original draft of the script, the sex bomb, as you've termed it, was supposed to be Jack's ship, which would be very appropriate given that name. But and it was supposed to be Jack's ship in a time loop. But Moffat thought that would have overcomplicated the story, so he changed it to just this war ambulance. But the reason I love the Chula warship is because, like, you have that moment towards the end of The Empty Child where Jack mentions that it's a Chula warship, and the Doctor has, like, that stereotypical Doctor Who beat of, like, realizing who the monster is. Like, he looks sort of in the middle distance and he's like, Chula! And you think that it's going to be just, like, an alien aggressor. But, of course, the Chula has nothing to do with it. It's just the name of a restaurant that Gatiss and his friends, met to celebrate getting the job at Doctor Who. But yeah, I just love that subversion. There's so many like deft narrative touches like that in the script that you can point to. It's just so polished.
What's interesting, because even though we have that beat in the first part about how Jack meant to point that there are ambulances in wars, like, you think it's a warship, but it's just an ambulance. But in the second part, that ambulance becomes more threatening because they clarify that the ambulance is equipping these people to be warriors, basically. And I think what that adds in is the element that even though there may be healing in the midst of a war, if it is just being put to the purpose of continuing that war and making that war sustainable, then there's an element of threat in it. And that links, of course, to the whole idea of the Doctor being, a war doctor or whatever, because that doesn't make him, pure just because he's going around healing people in a war. I read an opinion on this story that claimed it had been undermined or devalued somehow by how much Moffat had reminded it and repeated ideas from it over the course of his career. And I found that it's the opposite of the truth. I find it, watching this story today, I feel like it's richer for the fact that I can think of the ways in which it echoes, 15, 12 years later on. Like, I find it so satisfying.
Yeah, Moffat's first 3 Doctor Who stories, this, The Girl in the Fireplace, and The Curse of Fatal Death, I feel like you can map out his entire filmography of Doctor Who from them, and that's a good thing. I don't see how that's a bad thing. He's got his own tics that he constantly refines and explores in new ways. But yes, his first 3 scripts, it's lovely how much of his later career evolves and iterates on the ideas and the dialogue within them.
I feel just one more maybe thing, like, I feel like the fact that this is a story where Moffat puts in the word Marxism seems to invite a class-based reading. But obviously, it's not a story that actually has much to do with Marxism at all, I find. Yeah. Even in the scene where it's mentioned, it's kind of Moffat just sort of like being a maybe slightly patronising nod to the ideal.
Yeah.
But class conflict is very much something that is looming at the edges of the story. I mean, it's literally about children who have to sort of storm into a house and to eat. So, and kind of taking back stuff that's been sort of hoarded and appropriated and kept away from them. So it's something that maybe, like, if there's one thing that kind of I find I want to be sort of kind of picked at more in the story compared to all the sex stuff, it might be that. But, like, on the whole, it's not that I'm dissatisfied with the story or anything.
I think the reappropriating the house stuff is so, like, in keeping with the Doctor Who ethos as well. Going right back to, Doctor and Susan using a junkyard for hiding, and even the fact that, like, they've repurposed a police box to use as a spaceship. It just feels so Doctor Who-y. It also feels a little bit press gangy to me, like the whole the crowd of, scrappy kids, making do. And I think that's why Moffat was commissioned to do this story. I think Russell gave him a pitch for kids in the Blitz, and he must have thought that, like, oh, press gang, he can do a gang of kids. So I think that's why he was given the story, or partially at least. But yeah, it feels like to me, like, when we're with Nancy and the kids, it's almost like watching press gang, and when we're with Jack, it's almost like watching Joking Apart or Coupling. It's like you get a little bit of a greatest hits tour. Oh yeah, looking at my notes here, did you guys get a hint of a, like, colonialist vibe from the nanogenes and, like, how they work? Just the whole idea of sending in something to another place, which is, like, intended, via some superior mindset to, like, help, like, as medicine. And it ends up, like, doing, serious, significant damage. Just, like, the horror of that, of, like, the complete misunderstanding of, and the assumption that, like, your methods are the best. It reminds me of, like, when the Doctor is tortured because, like, they don't get that he has 2 hearts, It's, like, that really visceral, horrific, yeah.
Even the resolution to defeating them is like a biologically determinist thing. It's that Nancy and Jamie are biologically related.
Well, I was saying that that's why the horror is effective. Like, that's why it's this like malappropriated medicine that's, like, been unleashed.
Yeah,
it just reminds me of, things.
It's very interesting in that it's episode that brings up the welfare state and is meant to, like, presage the NHS, and yet it's bringing up this idea of the spooky medicine that's forced on everyone and that corrupts them and whatever. So
that's true. Or, like, I guess wildlife would be a better comparison. Like, you bring in wildlife from, like, a different ecosystem, and then, I don't know. That's just something that I thought that, like, enhanced the, creepy factor.
I think, like, in another way, it's something that's maybe common to a lot of sort of Doctor Who stories. It's what happens when the system kind of systems from Earth, like, war and cons and capitalism and stuff, when they're scaled up to space and then Earth is kind of a victim of that, that's what happens. It's like, it puts Earth into a position of one of those countries that's being sort of affected by the kind of squabbles and kind of struggles of like, outer kind of empires elsewhere in space. So it's kind of like what would happen if we were subject to those processes, isn't it? So that's always kind of the story with aliens kind of dropping in and stuff. I feel like I want to say something about Rose getting literally swept off her feet by the barge balloon in that sequence where she's flying through the air. But like, I feel, thematically, I think it's maybe not that integrated, but I think the fact that there's a gag later about how she was literally swept off her feet turns it into another sex metaphor. And one of the, many of those are just littered around the story. And I think also I think it's just a great scene, like, of just, in terms of having a way of, I know Moffat was basically told to put in the scene of Rose hanging from the balloon because he wasn't using enough of the budget. So they said, like, put in an action scene. He was like, all right. But the scene is so good because it lets us actually get that bird's eye view of the air raid rather than just seeing it from the ground. So it's really worth doing. And for some reason, like, it all seems to fit so well, even though that stuff is maybe shoehorned in, because it's such a great way for Jack to be introduced and to kind of sort of seduce Rose in that way of kind of suspending her in midair. I find it all comes together in a very neat manner.
I think that having the Doctor at the end of the Doctor Dances basically proclaim that this is like the best day, that one of the best days that he's ever had, and by extension this is one of the best episodes he's ever been in. It's kind of one of the biggest like flexes I've ever seen a writer do, where you have like the Doctor basically out and say, this is my favorite episode of the series. It's like practically determining that it would win like the season polls and stuff. But it's also completely justified because you're right there with the Doctor in the jubilation that he feels at the ending.
Yeah, it's so keyed coherently into the wider characterization journey of the Ninth Doctor across the series, with all his angst over the Time War and I couldn't save any of them and all that sort of stuff. There must have been some interesting conversations with Russell, I think, but I saved everyone thing. It works completely in the context of the own episode. You don't need to know anything about the Time War for that to be a super impactful moment, just in terms of the episode's own story. But it definitely, I think the wider context of it is a huge part of why people still watch that clip so much and quote it so much and find it such a meaningful moment for the character, for sure.
Yeah, it kind of like that scene makes me feel how I understand the ending to The Day of the Doctor makes people feel. That like
yes, yeah,
jubilation. Not to diss Day of the Doctor, it's just like when I see people describe their reactions to that, it's like, yeah, that's me, but with this,
I think when it comes to the question of like, why do we enjoy episodes? Why do we get all these different meanings and stuff out of episodes? Because sometimes you can find that people might, let's say, oh, well, this episode is good because it's about technology or it has X or Y in it. But like with a story like this, the fact that we see the characters, not just the Doctor, but Jack and Nancy, we see them kind of going on these journeys and growing and kind of becoming liberated in different ways and accepting themselves and integrating these aspects of themselves. That's kind of what makes it feel like not just a story that has liberation in it, but a story that is liberating. Like a story that really actually has that feel of kind of liberation in it and that feel of empowerment in it. And and I think it's that element of there being actual characters in it who we go with and who we are kind of in the journey with that just makes all those meanings come through in such a powerful manner.
That was a good summation, but something that I thought would be fun is that like I have basically a list of all of the lines that were cut from the script. Notable lines, like lines with meat to them, not just like different phrasings or something. And I thought that like I could give a line and you could offer your speculations for why they were cut, because I think some of them are very interesting.
Okay.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah.
Okay. So, in the broadcast version, you have the Doctor talking to Jamie separated via the door, and the Doctor's kind of trying to understand who Jamie is, which also gives very like rich parallels to kind of Moffat's later hinted backstory for the Doctor, being left out in the shed, and even the Shobogans preparing the meal for him in Hellbent is very reminiscent of like what Nancy does for these kids, that sense of community. Anyway, that's irrelevant. The broadcast version, the Doctor says, "There's nobody here but us chickens." And in the script, he says, "There's nobody here but us kids." Well, this kid, referring to himself. So why do you think they changed kid to chicken?
I'm stumped personally. I don't think I'm not sure. Maybe they just want to try and make it more of a gag. I don't know.
Yeah, I've got no clue.
Maybe they felt that Eccleston the Doctor kind of referring himself to himself as a kid literally was maybe too cloying, like too on the nose, like, oh, I'm just a kid inside me. Whereas him actually making a gag like, oh, I'm a chicken, that's actually a more childish like action, if that makes sense.
I thought that they changed it from him saying that he's a kid because they thought that would be like too much of a thing that like a sexual predator would say. Like, oh, we're both kids, you know? And a chicken is much more neutral. Do you think that there's any validity to that? Because I think, because Russell T Davies is like editing this, and I think he has a much sort of more sensitive feel for these things than Moffat does,
I think, you may be right. Like, I mean, Listen, like, Moffat's later episode, Listen, that's something you can easily read, like, sex predator vibes into, and they're launching around the orphanage and sneaking into kids' rooms and stuff, and Moffat seems kind of oblivious to that reading. So, maybe.
So that's my take on that line. This one, I don't think you'll have much trouble figuring out why it was cut. Hang on, I just have to get to the page. Okay, so they're talking about the nanogenes on Jack's ship. The Doctor is explaining how they work, and he says, they activate when the bulkhead's sealed, and they check you out for damage, fix any physical flaws. And Rose says, still the same dress size. And the Doctor says, they have their limits. And Rose says, what are you trying to say? Because she's, it's a crack about, like, Rose's, physical appearance, basically. So off base.
That's very Series 8 Capaldi, sort of, like, making cracks at Clara's body sort of thing. I think, like, Series 8 was Moffat indulging all the times he had to cut those jokes out in earlier episodes.
Yeah, the Dr. Falls script tidbit where, like, Missy's final dying words is, men. Yeah. It's like him just undermining sort of the whole spirit of the story. So that one sort of was disappointing to read, but...
I think that makes me realise what people mean when they say they wish RTD could have been showrunning Moffat's later episodes, because, like, he left all those things in like, Series 6. Like, River's like, oh, I'm focusing on the dress size, and it's just like, oh my god, enough, please.
And in that very same exchange with the nanogenes, there's a really funny gag where it's after the Doctor makes the nanogenes scatter, and Rose is like, how did you make them do that? And he says, bullying subatomic life forms. Easy. Learned when I was a kid. And Rose says, there are so many different ways to say I had a lonely childhood. And I think that's really funny, but it was cut because, like, they don't want the Doctor to have been said to have been a bully. Like, that's just very off base for, the childlike hero. So I kind of get that.
I dare say it may also just have been cut, like, for pacing, because it just feels like a lot of lines to put into a gag at that point when the scene sort of maybe needs to be moving on a bit. Like, no one cares that he scattered some CGI particles, come on.
True. It also reminds me of that bit in Heaven Sent where he talks about communicating with the door. Like, the Doctor as a kid is just him interacting with inanimate objects like particles and doors, and it's very funny. I think that's it. I think that's all I have. I've mentioned all the other ones.
Those are interesting.
Yeah, thanks for those. That's really cool.
That was a nice note to end on. That's a good punchy ending.
I'm glad.
Yes, that was nice to chat about a very good pair of episodes.
And I still felt a good Doctor Who story for once, yeah.
Yeah, this is probably the first Who Cares I've done for, like, a Doctor Who episode that I like, I think. I mean, I've done Torchwood, Children of Earth, and I like that, but this is, the first Who that can actually say I really like. So that's nice.
And with that last tone of Tom closing us out, we're now going to move into the future. When are we, Gig?
Well, right now, we are in July 2022, and I don't remember how long it's been since we did the original chat, but I'm sure it was long enough.
We've warped from November 2020, so a lot has happened in between then. So when we last talked, it was between Series 12 of the show and... well, not even Series 12 on Flux, Series 12 and Revolution of the Daleks, which also kind of flags up Captain Jack, John Barrowman, since we talked so much about them in the original discussion. So, like I said at the top of this discussion, this is just a little pickup to add some bits and bobs from the intervening almost 2 years since we had the first talk. So do you want to start, Gig? Anything you want to add? Any reflections on that earlier talk or any new thoughts or anything like that?
Well, there is one kind of biggish thing. I mean, listening back to the original chat and sort of cringing at myself babbling about nonsense for such a long period of time, I was kind of hoping I'd say something or to link these things together, and I never did. So something I was thinking about a lot, because I brought up Fenric at one point, and we looked at how there was a matrix of ideas in this story, The Empty Child, specifically things like the effects of war, repressive sexual morality, patriarchal kind of repressive morality, and technology kind of working without a conscience, and how these ideas seem to fit together quite well in this story. And it struck me that it can't be a coincidence that we have not one but two separate stories that use this matrix of ideas and are such just banger stories. They work together so well. And I was thinking, like, what is it that makes those things fit together just in such an interesting and generative way? Because sex and war are kind of that's a done thing. You know, make love not war. That's the original, isn't it? So there's a long history of that. And because sex is something that belongs to the masses, whereas war is really waged from above. Often it's kind of done in defense of maybe abstract concepts like nation or, you know, larger groups of people. So it's something like that. You've got that basic dichotomy. But where technology comes in, I think, is where it gets really interesting. Because in the story, we see the nanogenes. They're computers, basically, and they're operating without a conscience. They're just treating people as bits of information, bits of data. And also, of course, you have the empty child who can speak through typewriters, phone lines, whatever. Whereas, you know, to compare with Fenric, you've got a big computer of doom that's going to run this algorithm and cause the end of the world in this nuclear apocalypse. Anyway, and I think what it is that the computers provide a really good metaphor that links the logic of war and the logic of oppression. Because what computers kind of do is that in allowing us to diffuse ourselves into abstract reproductions, recordings, information, data, they kind of help to alienate us from our flesh and blood bodies, from our natures as contradictory beings of feelings, rather than just, you know, points of data. And in the way, that's kind of what these two other things, the logic of war and the logic of oppression, that's what both of them do as well. Both of those things treat people as, I guess, information, bits of data, you know, things that are intended to follow these abstract rules, these kind of inhuman, cold rules, even though, you know, as creatures, as human beings, we're not necessarily going to fit into that so well. So when you have wars, when you have bombs, raids going on, stuff like that, within that, the calculations being made are ones wherein the victims of such wars, people who die, you know, civilians who die, whatever, even people who die in battles, they're just bits of information. They're just data points, and they're collateral damage in a way. So just like Jamie in this story, The Empty Child, you know, he's caught in a bomb blast. He just becomes basically a casualty, a victim, an accepted consequence of this war. And on the other hand, when you have sexual taboos, shames, stigma, kind of rules kind of put in place to control people, like those that dictate that you can't have sex out of wedlock, for example, you get people who fall through the cracks of such a system, people who are collateral damage of a system like that, like Jamie, because his existence is taboo, because he is not supposed to exist, because he is a product of sex out of wedlock, and everyone has to pretend that he is not Nancy's child. You know, he is collateral damage of that system. He has been severed from reality, from his actual origin, from humanity, from the natural phenomenon that caused his existence. So in the same way, his status as a victim of that bomb blast is also kind of a metaphor for his status being severed, you know, from him being this victim of that other system as well. So those things kind of link together through that medium of the nanogenes, which is just soullessly replicating and treating, you know, humans as these data points which can just be, you know, tinkered with or calculated at will, and will ultimately just cause the destruction of mankind. So I think it's really interesting because but when that happens to Jamie, he becomes a creature of information alone, because the nanogenes basically make him this thing that can communicate through any, I guess, technological medium, you know, phone lines, typewriters, whatever, and only by I guess acknowledging and accepting the sex that happened can Nancy basically reconnect both herself and Jamie to nature, to their humanity, to their existence as, you know, creatures of feeling rather than just rules. And in that sense, I guess it's a slightly more optimistic view of technology, because then the nanogenes can become something that takes that positive and natural, I guess, restored image of humanity and replicates that to the rest of the population, instead of the alienated, atomized, destroyed, collateral damage victim version of Jamie, who's just this undead zombie. So, I guess in these stories, like war and repression are kind of the same thing. They're mechanisms of control that erase our humanity. They impose rules that are incompatible with us as human beings. And by confronting, I guess, the real humanity that's being undermined by all of these systems, we can get back some semblance of ourselves, some semblance of knowledge of who we are. And I guess that's a first step towards healing society, I guess, from the effects of war. And that's just a huge dump of thoughts that I've been having in the lead up to this debrief that I just felt I really wanted to get across. I could probably write an essay about this story and Fenric and how they link together in such a really cool way. And I'm probably going to do that now, but that's something I want to put across.
Yes, it felt like a verbal presentation of a Gigahoo article. Absolutely. That's a high compliment. That was really well said. What interests me there is I feel like, so we're talking through those three kind of separate, well, they're not really separate how they're being written here, but those three concerns like of sex, technology, and war or oppression. And kind of at the top of this conversation, we were linking in how much this set of episodes feels like a kind of iteration on Moffat's sex comedies, like Joking Apart and Coupling. And those are linking sex and technology all the time. That's the technofarce that Moffat writes, is, linking those up and finding ways to do interesting little writing through those. But war isn't something you get in Joking Apart or Coupling. And even in a class way, I don't think you get oppression like you were linking much either. So do you think it's... Because I think of Moffat's other stories, like Silence in the Library, I think might go more encompassing with the things it's trying to pull together. But Blink and Fireplace, while they're super tight scripts, I don't feel this kind of scope from them that Empty Dancers has. So do you think it's like the setting that's really enabled Moffat to kind of go this broad and bring in all these things to link together in like a Fenric-esque way? Was that like the key to how he wrote something so large here? What do you think?
I think it is. Certainly among his work, especially up to that point, his historical settings hadn't featured hugely, I don't think. So, and I think not just being a historical episode, but also that specific setting of a war and taking place in Britain in that period of time, I think it unlocked a huge wealth of potential connections and things, maybe not even entirely conscious things, but things that Moffat could really delve into and play off and just find all these little links within. So I think it was a huge opportunity. We don't see quite the same things happen in like Girl in the Fireplace, for example, even though that is a historical episode, but that doesn't have, I guess, this looming a prospect of like the World War, for example, looming over it. So I guess this really specific setting it just really blows open, I guess, the potential for Moffat as a writer.
I think it's also Moffat, at his age and in his nation, like there's I guess lived experience is the wrong term, but there's like a real lived history of World War II that he would have soaked up all his life in a way that he wouldn't have that kind of shorthand for a lot of other periods he would have touched on in Doctor Who.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm thinking of, like Let's Kill Hitler has sex, technology, and war, absolutely, but it feels disparate to me, where this feels really fractal and really linked. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but I think all these 4 stories in RTD's first era felt like these kind of standalone packages where he was like doing his whole version of the show as kind of its singular holistic thing, just in 4 different ways. I think that's a really appealing thing to talking about these. But talking about history, listening back to myself talk like 2 years ago, I had a similar experience of you thinking like, what, how am I talking back here? Just because I thought I talked with too much authority when I was eagerly presenting my interpretation of the history right here. I don't disagree with what I said. I just disagree with how I kind of said, this is the nature of the history. Britain was actually doing that. Australia was actually in this position, therefore, blah, blah, blah. That's the view I'm sympathetic with and that I agree with. But I don't think I talk the same way now that,
You
that
just
I
feel
did
you were
2
too
years ago.
soapboxy about it at the time?
Yeah.
Or? Well, if it's true, you should say it. If it's true, you should say it. I don't think there's any shame in that.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the history is is kind of the key to why this is such a huge story in a lot of ways. But talking about Fireplace, like we touched on, that's another thing that really interests me here, because we were talking about how this story feels like an iteration on Moffat's earlier shows, Joking Apart and Coupling. And since 2020, we've had another big next step in that line, which was Moffat's cut short The Time Traveler's Wife adaptation in 2022. I think it's interesting listening back to us talk about this being like the embracing sexual liberation, the focus on motherhood. There's still lingering bits of Moffat's oddities towards gender, but it feels like the same way that Press Gang felt so forward, and then, 2 steps forward, well, 1 step forward, 2 steps back with some of Moffat's later work. Empty Dancers kind of feels that way to me, with the kind of nuanced view on motherhood and the Nancy character, which I think Moffat wasn't writing women as complicated or interesting as that in his next few things, maybe, at least on Doctor Who. But I think it's interesting now that we have another story or adaptation in this kind of legacy of these types of shows. Does anything about The Time Traveler's Wife shine interestingly for you now in context of Empty Dancers and where that stood in his career?
Well, Moffat does sway back and forth over the course of his life in very interesting ways. I mean, you can speculate about all the different reasons for that may be. And yeah, you can often spot things where maybe he's more nuanced earlier on, then gets less nuanced later on, and then he comes back and more nuanced later on, or whatever. And then the complication with Time Traveler's Wife, of course, is that he's going back in a way. He's going back to the source, something that's quite old, something that was influencing him like way earlier, but he's adapting it as he is now. So you could call it a step back in some ways, but also just because it's, because he's still older, he's still growing up as a person, it's also a step forward. I think, one thing that's, I guess, notable with Empty Dances is that, and I guess something that lots of people who don't really like Moffat kind of maybe pick up on, is that unlike Moffat's later work, Empty Dances doesn't really revolve a huge amount around time travel or time hijinks or anything like that. I mean, it's pretty much devoid of such antics. Whereas, if you look at his next 2 stories for RTD, Girl in the Fireplace and Blink, those are extremely timey-wimey. One of those actually introduced the term timey-wimey. Whereas Empty Dances is before that element really blazes into his work at all. So Empty Dances is kind of like, it's like a snapshot of what Moffat's writing could be like if he kind of put aside his love of temporal screwing or temporal screwing in one way. The one, but I guess his love of structural toying or trickery. Empty Dances is kind of it's almost in paring back some of that. Well, it would be mean to say gimmickry, but paring back some of that gimmickry and introducing just letting, I guess, a single time and place sort of swell up to take over the whole story. You get something that's really nuanced in some other ways, and I guess it's like maybe a cancelled alternative possibility for where Moffat's writing could have gone. But that's also unfair because a lot of elements of this are still lingering throughout the rest of Moffat's work. So you can't really separate one thing from other things because it's all one writer, it's all one guy.
Yeah. There's another person I wanted to talk about. If you have anything else to say about Moffat, though, I'd like to hear it.
No, I think I'm all Moffated out for the moment.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a bit in passing. We haven't really talked about it head on as of July 2022, I don't think. Are you glad we recorded that discussion in 2020 in the sense that I liked how we approached our discussion about Captain Jack? I think we came at it from a lot of angles, and I think we were pretty encompassing with how we were talking about how the character was made and who contributed to it. Are you happy we discussed that in 2020?
I'm content with it because I think the truth is between 2020 and right now, nothing actually new was revealed about Captain Jack or any persons relating to him. So in a sense, well, it would be wrong to say nothing has changed, but also in a very real sense, things were the same then as they are now, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, it's like the air around something has changed, but the thing itself has not changed. That's the funny thing with all the Barrowman stuff is that, even calling them receipts, I think kind of frames things in a funny way because it was stuff so known and so freely talked about. Like there's that video for the end of RTD1 era. God knows what sort of video the second RTD era will end with. But that video where like David Tennant is openly joking about Barrowman exposing himself and all these other things that in early 2021 kind of had a reignition on social media. It's such a funny narrative around that because I see a lot of people think that Noel Clarke like brought it up or like tried to displace the fires on him over to Barrowman, where that wasn't it at all. It was just...
Yeah, that sounds like a conspiracy theory, to be honest. Like, that wouldn't even need to happen. People did it, of their own volition.
The Noel Clarke stuff hit the news when over 20 women, accused him of sexual harassment. And then while that kind of thing was igniting on social media, a video from 2015 bubbles up of a convention where other actors that had worked with Barrowman were discussing Barrowman exposing himself, which again is something it's not just been freely talked about on like Doctor Who special features and Doctor Who stuff. It's been, he made a sort of apology in 2008 on the radio. He was pulled up over like a theatrical thing to do with it in 2018. There's been rumors circulating about stuff to do with Arrow for a long time as well. Like none of this was ever secret, but times change. And so following the Noel Clarke thing, I guess there was a lot of gas on that fire after that. And so we kind of got a reappraisal of Barrowman, so to speak. Yeah,
is that a way of putting it?
And I think Barrowman's personality himself is to kind of pour more gas on fires, basically, through his kind of... He handled it kind of evasively. And, when he eventually made a statement about a month later in May, it was... I guess it was a little bit conciliatory, but it was... I don't think he was falling over himself to kind of exonerate himself in the way that I think a lot of fans of him and fans of the Captain Jack character wanted, like a total kneeling exoneration, which I think makes sense to me to desire that, because like we talked about in our discussion, it's a really good character that Barrowman is one of the three men I think to principally make.
And I don't think it would have been very hard for him to actually... I mean, just in terms of like the physical effort it would take to have done what fans wanted, I don't think it would have been like some huge like task to just address it immediately and with some degree of like genuine contrition, just so, because certainly the allegations toward Barrowman don't have the same like scope as those towards Noel Clarke, for example, of like the same like degree of harm, but like people were grossed out by it, and so the fact that he in some senses dug his heels in is what really compounded it and just made it escalate to the situation where he was getting blacklisted from stuff.
And to this day, the way he talks, I mean, this is a kind of situation, and I think things may change, towards one way or the other in time. Will we ever hear Absent Friends? Maybe one day. I mean, it was only this year that Barrowman was kind of gleefully, what was he saying? He took that selfie video of himself at a convention and he like, they love me. And he turned around and it was like all the fans cheering at him. There's a funny kind of ego thing going on here, which I think is interesting because like you say, it's to even compare what Noel Clarke was accused of doing, by such a severity of people to what Barrowman was doing. I don't think anyone reasonable is trying to minimize what Barrowman did, which is obviously, wrong and disgusting, of course. But I think people were eager to forgive him. I think people really wanted to be in a position. They wanted him to put them in a position. Well, okay. They really wanted to be presented with a position where they felt they really wanted to forgive him, basically. I think people really wanted him just to put words in the right order, where everyone could go, yep, that was bad, but it's totally over now. It's nothing like, this much more assault stuff, more targeted harassment stuff. I think people really wanted to minimize it, but when he minimizes it, it's like, well, people can't then, because it's like there hasn't been the display that I think that people kind of were asking for there.
Yeah, and there's no like real reckoning with it, I guess. It's just yeah. And I think awkwardly, I think like what it leads to is, I guess, this really awkward situation where like you mentioned, Absent Friends, for example, like Barrowman was still very much like embroiled in that whole spin-off world, and that world of like still being connected with, I guess, the wider Doctor Who quote unquote family, so to speak. Whereas like, and I think people, well, fans certainly, they love content and they love crossovers and people are being together and friendly and stuff. So when you have something like that that's kind of looming over everything, that becomes really hard to sustain. I think fans, like, obviously, they want really good character, they love the actor, they want to forgive and forget and everything, but also they just want those relationships to stay intact. Whereas it becomes really awkward if no actual, I guess, real reckoning or like settling of accounts has taken place.
And I think it's tricky because there are some stories and some characters where, whether it makes much sense or not, people will try and divorce the creative from the creation to kind of enjoy it in that way. There's lots of, books where people will try and, maybe focus more on the adaptations or just try and push the author out a little bit so they can more freely.
A good recent example of that, the official sport of Quidditch is renaming itself to dissociate from J.K. Rowling. So it's very news at the moment.
Exactly. The issue with Barrowman, like we talked about a lot on here, is I don't think you can say, Captain Jack is just a RTD character. Barrowman had nothing to do with it. You can't say he's just a Moffat character or a Chibnall character. I think part of the true greatness of the character is how many minds went into him, but inarguably one of the greatest, if not the greatest mind, entering into that character was Barrowman himself, and how he initially presented his performance here and how he modulated it, in further roles across the different shows. So the performance is so central to the character and the creation of the character that I don't think it's really a situation where people can just be content with Captain Jack novels or something. Not that they'd even, I think, be made at this point, especially since you'd need his likeness on the cover, to sell them anyway. I don't think he's a character people can freely remove from the performer.
Some characters become almost like avatars for the performer behind them. Like you can see the character comes to represent some element of the actor's personality or persona, so to speak. So John Barrowman is this this flashy kind of camp guy, and that sort of larger than lifeness is represented in Captain Jack. So it really is, it's inextricable because the character becomes a means by which the actor shows his quote unquote brilliance, so to speak. So that's the thing. When people, the two things are really wrapped up in each other, and the fans' love of one is wrapped up in their love of the other.
And this is where, like, how much I love Torchwood. I love it significantly more than a lot of Doctor Who in a lot of ways. I stopped watching Doctor Who at a certain point because I wasn't into it anymore, and I kept on watching Torchwood for those times. I'm a huge Torchwood fan, and I don't want to stop talking about Torchwood. And in that sense, I don't want to stop talking about Captain Jack necessarily. I don't think that's the sense of the situation we've been put in, and I don't like the idea of kind of giving this man's ego and his mishandling of the situation the power to do that, to like shut us up. I don't like that at all. I think that feels like a really dissatisfying way to go about it. But the issue is, I think people really do take signals from this sort of thing. I think the mere act of talking about Captain Jack in a way where you don't open with this kind of the submission that he's not doing, basically, that, of course I condemn, so-and-so, of course I condemn sexual harassment, which, yes, of course you do. Of course we do. And of course, ideally, everyone should. They don't, but everyone should. But it just puts, I think, the fandom in this tricky situation where is that how things meant to go now? Like if you want to talk about Captain Jack as a character, do you have to stick in this kind of consolation that, I condemn so-and-so at the start? Like, is that the position we're in? I think it's tricky, especially because of the nature of what he did and the way it was so eagerly talked about. It dissatisfies me. Like, I can't condemn what he did enough. I think at any workplace I've been at, I don't want anything like that happening. No matter if other people were enjoying it there, no matter if other workers there were enjoying it, it's not something that should be at a workplace at all, let alone some of the other things floating around. But at the same time, I think it's a really individualistic way to pin it all on the one man. And I think this is part of why he's chafing at it. He's going, but you were all laughing at me. You were referencing what I was doing in your videos with David Tennant, beloved to this day, who's back on the show now. Who else is back on the show? All the producers of this time, Russell T Davies, Phil Collins and Julie Gardner, Jane Tranter. They're all back, and Chris Chibnall, who he worked with on Torchwood, just ran Doctor Who for years. Why is all the ire getting singularly placed at Barrowman, who did these actual actions? But, I think what Christopher Eccleston's been saying in recent years, really highlights that these aren't events taking place in a vacuum. They're events enabled by leadership in a lot of ways, or they're not significantly...
Yeah, it's a cultural thing.
Yeah, exactly. So it dissatisfies me. I think that's why the idea of having to make the consolation every time I want to talk about Torchwood or Captain Jack, of course, it was so terrible what Barrowman did. It is, but why isn't there an expectation for whenever we talk about RTD or Julie Gardner or Phil Collinson? Why isn't there an expectation of doing it there then? And if there was an expectation, what do our conversations look like at that point? And where do we start extending it? Because there's... I guess when we talk about Moffat, we very often do dip in and out of stuff we find troublesome, with what he's said or, how he's run certain things over the years.
I mean, it helps that he always puts that stuff in his writing as well, so it's always on topic.
That's very true, yeah. But do you get what I mean? It just, I kind of chafe at this idea of a need to signal your kind of distaste for sexual harassment, as obvious as that is. I chafe at the idea, or maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm seeing a expectation that isn't there, but I feel a kind of expectation to do that when discussing Captain Jack now. I didn't in 2020 when we recorded this, even though we knew all this stuff, because there wasn't that cultural expectation of doing that then. We all obviously condemned sexual harassment then, but it was that cultural thing where there wasn't that kind of reckoning with it yet. And now there's kind of a reckoning from the fandom side towards Barrowman, but it just bothers me that I feel this expectation to preface what I say about Captain Jack with this kind of discussion where there's not that expectation really to do it with RTD.
I think basically, certainly if we're to discuss reasons for Barrowman's conspicuous absence from the franchise going forward, then obviously it's something that's going to come up. Whereas I think when you're looking backwards at stuff, I guess looking at Torchwood, looking at Empty Child, I think when you've got these on-set sort of issues and such, it's like... I think it's tough because at the end of the day, when you're talking about a work, you're not necessarily there to make pronounced judgments about the personalities of the people involved with the work. Yeah, but at the same time, obviously there's no, you don't need to sort of go around making excuses for the behaviour of the people in the work either. So it's like, I think that there are going to be times. I think it's just a case by case thing. There's going to be times when it's important to flag up the problems and things that are problematic about something, and times when it's just sort of it's context, and context is always useful and important, but at the same time I don't think it's some sort of moral wrong to talk about the empty child in a way that's just talking about just the stuff to do with that character and stuff to do with the content of the story and the acting and stuff like that. I think as time goes on, the intensity, the heat, the spotlight around this kind of issue will maybe sort of, I guess it'll fizzle out over time, I suppose. And maybe there will be less of what you talk about, an expectation maybe to sort of constantly interject with this and this and this, and to preface every discussion of it with this and this and this. Although at the same time, you would... I guess it's related to, it's connected to the nature of what happened, because I think if we were going to talk about Noel Clarke, for example, I think absolutely I would be completely I think it would be completely normal for anyone to preface any conversation about Noel Clarke with this guy was going through his career doing these horrible things, whereas with Barrowman, because it's something that was so, I guess, accepted by the other people working on the show and the culture around the show, something that was so just waved off, hand waved away, laughed off, it's something that's embedded in just all the practitioners involved with the work and with RTD and stuff. So it's I guess it's not as much of a scar or a trauma on the program itself, I guess, which is why I think it doesn't feel that essential to conversations about it. Just trying to sum up all that babbling I was just doing.
No, yeah, I don't want it to fizzle out. You know, I don't want in 5 years for people to not find it weird if you talk about Captain Jack without any prefacing. In my ideal world would be a much larger reckoning, which includes, you know, all the people involved and the facets of the production. Like, I hate when people try and dismiss the Barrowman thing by saying, well, it looks like Eve Miles, you know, thought it was funny. So it's like, so the cast just exists now. What about the crew? Have we heard what the drivers thought of it? Have we heard what the catering people thought of it? What if they, you know, were really seriously affected by, you know, nudity out of nowhere? Like, I know it can seem funny, and it would have been genuinely funny to some people, I'm sure, but there's a lot of people, you know, for whatever reason, they might just find it distasteful, or they could find that really confronting. You know, I think it's a whole encompassing thing, and for it to kind of kept going for years, and it's not just inept leadership. If it's being made a joke of in, you know, a parting video, that is valid. It's not just validation. It's not just acceptance. It's like, it's finding joy in it. You know, it's kind of
consciously minimizing any sort of problem with it,
from the producers. And so I just RTD2 starting, and, you know, this joy over the producers coming back, you know, in a creative sense, you know, I'm very happy to talk about that, and we have talked about that a lot, and we'll talk about that much more, you know. But my ideal world would be this encompassing way where it's all the big conversation, and it's not things just getting displaced into one, you know, easy little package of, well, we'll just condemn this person so then we can guilt-free enjoy David Tennant's back, you know, and Right ADD's back. That's what chafes at me, I think, with how the discussions are working now.
Yeah, and I think another thing that I think another reason it kind of feels weird is that, like, it's the hypocrisy, isn't it? And almost like,
yes,
I guess not to sympathise too much with Barrowman, but like the way in which, well, you know, Big Finch can go, okay, we're cancelling this audio with Barrowman, and now we're absolved, we're good now. It's like, really, you know, it's just sort of the idea of compartmentalising everything down to, like, okay, do this product or don't do that product, and that's how we engage with issues of, like, you know, people's behaviour now. It's just it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like it's actually really engaging with the issues at all.
I don't know if this is a tasteful comparison to make. It just came to me now. Do you remember in the weeks and the months of the... to bring it back to Moffat, what his most recent last bit of Doctor Who was that Best of Days minisode with Bill, talking about, you know, the peak of the Black Lives Matter protests. When that was at its kind of biggest pitch, you know, in terms of the cultural conversation, all these companies were doing these things where, like, they were changing imagery to do with brands, or they were editing certain episodes of TV shows. Yeah.
The black square.
Exactly that. And, you know, like, I mean, one aspect of it you could say is, but why wasn't this done earlier? If it was worth doing, which, you know, you can compare with the Barrowman thing of why did we only start condemning it at this point if it was always bad. But the thing I'm more thinking of was, I remember a lot of people, you know, going, we're not asking for this. You know, we're asking for an actual reckoning. We're asking for actual change. We're not asking you to muck around with the TV show community. You know, it's no one's really crying out for that. That's, you know, in a desperate position, or that's within threat of violence, or, you know, systemic oppression of anything. And so when I see all this ire directed at Barrowman and then, you know, kind of selectively withdrawn for other producers, and this is what really inflamed me, oxygen being taken away from what Noel Clarke did and given to Barrowman instead.
Yeah.
I don't think, speaking, you know, for people who've experienced sexual assault or sexual harassment, I don't think all the oxygen going to Barrowman is a very representational thing, let alone a moralistic thing, like I think it's being presented as. I think it's trite in some senses, basically, and I think it's easy to, you know, to displace all this onto him instead of this culture, you know, around it. But I think as people want to enjoy RTD2, I think it'll continue progressing that way, basically.
Yeah, I think what you're describing is basically what happens when, I guess, activism, so to speak, is translated into the language of fanishness and consumerism, almost. So basically watered down to the point of complete worthlessness. I guess it expressed through a language that only understands consumption, product, fan loves for specific characters or things, and just exists in this world of abstracts rather than any tangible material change or improvement.
I think part of the root of why I was thinking so much, about these expectations of do we preface all discussions of Captain Jack with this kind of stuff now is, I think you'll agree with me in that it feels absurd to even say this, but there's absolutely zero and should be zero expectation of someone having to have consumed something else to judge something in the first place. This is part of why we poke at it's too early to judge as an idea all the time. This idea that you're not allowed to judge something unless you've experienced something in some perfect creator ordained way. By that I mean, I think you'd agree that you have no issue with someone reading, just maybe your most recent blog article, whatever it happens to be, and coming up with their own opinions in response to it on the basis of that, rather than absorbing all your body of work first. The same way that, someone's first video or podcast they ever listened to us could be this one. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. How could there be? That's totally normal. You can enter in anywhere. They don't have the context of some of the other stuff we believe or have said, but that's totally fine because there's never any expectation of that. But it bothers or upsets me a little bit, and it's unavoidable and it's totally fine. But when someone might misidentify us as something we're not, people might perceive us as rabid haters of Steven Moffat, as sometimes happens when we've spent hundreds of hours of our lives
gushing about him
basically. And so I guess my worry is that people perceive us as condoning certain things just on the basis of giving oxygen to the Captain Jack character at all, or similar things like that. That's part of what bothers me. But I guess that's just unavoidable because there's no expectation, and there shouldn't be an expectation of people getting to know you, online before reacting to something you're saying. Yeah,
and I suppose in the same way, if someone is to talk about or discuss an old episode like Empty Child or something else that Captain Jack was in the past, it's not necessarily. I wouldn't say there's necessarily some huge demand on them to know all the stuff about what Barrowman is in real life before they can analyze it or process it or talk about it. That's kind of linked to the context thing as well.
Yeah, that's well said. Is that it? Are you happy with all that?
We didn't know that RTD was coming back when we recorded this. The original, did we?
It's such a large elephant in the room that I wasn't even thinking about it. Yeah. That's another reason I'm really glad we recorded it when we did. I think it's an interesting little artifact in some ways now when we talked about it. Yeah, that's why we don't use RTD1 at all in that discussion, whereas we have been using it now. It's totally possible Moffat has another first episode in an RTD era of Doctor Who. This isn't even necessarily the only one now. That kind of hinges on the Barrowman stuff we were talking about, of having the same people in charge again. What was that line in Years and Years? These old men are in power forever, from Russell Tovey's character. But yeah, so we were talking so much about this being such a fully formed birth of a new vision for the show, the 2005 series in general, but very specifically this Moffat set of episodes as well. So it's interesting to reflect on now that there's an attempt to make that happen again, I guess.
Yeah, although in a sense it's partly through just reviving this whole Tennant Tate era. Yeah. Actually, it brings to mind an amusing Barrowman comment. He talked about the end of series 4 as the golden era, although it's one that doesn't actually exist. Yeah.
That's what I love is when he said something about wouldn't it be perfect if Barrowman, Tennant, and Rose Tyler, made a movie together, a Doctor Who movie together. I think that's, the golden age coming back together, that not quite existent golden age.
Yeah.
But when he said that a few years ago, that sounded like such a joke and, a pathetic old Barrowman trying to weasel back into the show. But now, that if not for, what has transpired with the reevaluation of Barrowman, that totally feels like something that could happen. We've got, you know, Tennant and Tate and Wilf coming back for basically some sort of anniversary movie type thing. I could totally see this shitpost idea of a 10 Jack Rose movie happening if things were a little bit different. That's kind of what the show has become now, or is becoming now. So that's so different than the kind of seminal way we were discussing these 2005 episodes, I guess. Yeah.
And there's going to be some quite potent irony if, in the sense, this Barrowmanized version of the show doesn't have Barrowman in it in any way. Like he's been excluded from his own fantasy. It's kind of funny.
That's really powerful, yeah, to phrase it like that. Wow. It's like those missing years he's always been plagued, you know, even in this episode. It's a shame Tomtit couldn't join us for this debrief discussion, but yeah, I think we went over a lot of interesting new things or reevaluated things in light of the 2005 episodes and our 2020 first discussion of them. And that truly concludes this set of discussions on The Empty Child and the Doctor Dancers. We would absolutely love to hear what you thought about our first discussion, the 2021, as well as the second discussion Gig and I had in 2022. Let us know what you think. The episodes themselves, our thoughts on them then, our thoughts on them now, anything you got. We always love hearing it. And thank you very much for listening. Thanks.